talk I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I want to thank John for letting me come out here and do this. This was a really hard talk to put together because it turns out that putting 150 years of history into two talks is not an easy thing to do. So I really do think this talk could easily be extended to many, many parts. And maybe in the future we'll have other people come in and give other parts to this that they have their expertise in, and that would be really great to see that. So the reason for this is that AI has such a long and complicated history. There are many different strands of research, and not all of them intersect in a unified way. So to get inspiration for thinking about how I wanted to frame this talk, I went and looked at some papers and I watched some YouTube videos, and I noticed that they almost always started with either the Turing test or the famous 1956 Dartmouth conference, and that's kind of where it all begins for them. But looking at where AI is going right now and all of the interest and hype that's happening, it's interesting to think about how this hype compares to the hype that we saw in the 1960s prior to the first AI winter, which is going to be what we'll cover in this talk today. So I think it's really important to think about the way that history and historical context frames the way that we look at questions and the way that we think about our problems. And so going back and looking at what was the precursor historically to the events that led up to the AI conference in 1956. Where did the researchers get their ideas from? I think this is a really important perspective to have because it makes us think about what kind of baggage we hold on to about the way we think about computers and the brain and the mind and so on. So what I'm going to do here today is tell more of a story than a history. And to focus everything together, I want to focus on two different questions. On the one hand, what is intelligence? And on the other, how do intelligent systems represent knowledge? So I will say that we will not answer these questions today. I don't think they really have answers yet. But today will be a setup as well for the talk that I'm going to give in a couple weeks. I think it's 3 weeks from now, roughly, on after the AI winter, where I think we're getting closer to resolving some of these questions. So we'll set up the idea here today. So as I said before, most of the treatments begin with the Dartmouth conference, the Turing test, but these ideas did not appear from nowhere. So what was the historical precedence, and how do they agree upon the fact that they were going to use symbolic logic as the language of AI to describe what AI systems do? So I traced this to 4 key events. One is the developments in the theory of computation. This would be some stuff in the 1820s. And it would answer questions about what does it mean to compute something and what types of things are computable. The second would be developments in symbolic logic. This is more on the side of history of mathematics, but those who were involved in this field were also heavily involved in philosophy and thinking about the way that language connects us to the external world and the way that logic is the way that our brain, apparently according to them, expressed this language. And finally, this 4th point is not talked about too much, but it's a shift away from behaviorism, which was the predominant metaphor of the time for thinking about how the brain worked, and it influenced the way, shifting away from it influenced how people thought about the question of AI in the 1950s. So we'll start first with this question, what is intelligence? So there's many perspectives on this, and someone in the humanities might tell you something like compassion or morality, curiosity, sacrifice, love, and so on. And this is a very sci-fi way to look at AI. And I think one day AI might have some of these sorts of traits that we identify with humanity. But an AI researcher has a different perspective. And essentially, they're trying to formalize basic everyday reasoning. So defining intelligence, this comes from a textbook, Rich and Knight. They describe AI as being able to perform some mundane tasks, things like speech and vision, things that we take for granted every single day. And more formal tasks, things like games, mathematics, that have a constrained set of rules in a state space. And more expert tasks, things that we need to spend a lot of time studying, we can put that knowledge into a semantic network that we can then query if we have all of that information loaded in there. And as part of our wish list, we also want knowledge to be generalizable in some way. And this is the difference between strong and weak AI. So most of the systems that we have today are something closer to weak AI that are very domain specific, whereas strong AI is generalized, much like the human mind, and is able to pick apart any type of data and understand make some sort of knowledge claim about it or understand what it is. We also want knowledge to be represented in a way that we can understand. There's often more than one way to model something and to describe a system, and we want the system to represent it in a way that makes sense to us. And we'll briefly talk about as well what this question of representation actually is. And the world is dynamic, so we don't want just static models. We want models that integrate time and different spatiotemporal hierarchies. And we also want to avoid things like systems that need to be constantly updated because they cannot learn on their own. And we're moving more toward this, but we'll see that the topics we cover today are systems that require a lot of maintenance and a lot of human input and able to keep the model updated to modern times. So in talking about intelligence, I think it's a good place to start is this quote from Hegel. This book in 1985 is a really important landmark book in AI. And he would say, the fundamental goal is not merely to mimic intelligence or produce some clever fake, not at all. AI wants only the genuine article, machines with minds in the full and literal sense. This is not science fiction, but real science based on a theoretical conception as deep as it is daring. Namely, we are at root computers ourselves. So my background is actually in computational neuroscience. And when we model the brain, we think about the question in the same kind of way. We think about what kind of statistical model is the brain using. And the assumption is that we are computers ourselves. But if this is really true, it begs the question, what does it mean to compute something? And in what way are our minds computing things? And how can we replicate this in a machine? So answering this question relied on the development of a theory of computation. And this really begins with Charles Babbage's work in the 1820s. There are some historical records of computational machines throughout antiquity, such as the Greeks, which had machines that were used in astronomy. But Babbage created the first true automatic calculator, the difference engine. And it was able to approximate complex functions. And while a prototype was built, it was never actually finished. And it was succeeded by the analytical engine in the 1830s, which actually had a number of very modern type of features that we would associate with computers today, including memory and the ability to be programmed with control statements, and it used punch cards as well. It was never entirely built, but the work was extended upon by others. And one of those who extended the work would be the lady Ada Lovelace in 1842, where she took Babbage's original transcription as notes, and she added her own translation and transcription extra notes to that document. And she realized that you could build complex programs with this machine and provided the first description of what we might call an algorithm today. So by all rights, she is the first computer programmer. But she did not realize the potential of this machine in terms of artificial intelligence. As she says, the analytical engine has no pretensions whatever to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. It can follow analysis, but it has no power of anticipating any analytical relations or truths. So this is a point that Turing will bring up in his paper. He will actually respond to this, claiming that computers and machines can do this, and they can learn from feedback. So it's interesting to see this perspective from the 1800s here. So following this, we had some scattered landmarks in the formulation of symbolic logic, which would eventually become the language of AI that the researchers in the 1950s would begin to use. So Boole's work on predicate logic, as well as Frege's work establishing the logical basis of arithmetic axioms, would be a really important landmark in this area. So following this, we have the foundations of logical positivist movement in the 1900s, and this was primarily spearheaded by people like G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell, who were trying to find a grounding, mathematical grounding, logical grounding for mathematics. And they made a number of contributions to the development of symbolic logic, as well as finding a way to think about how logic actually connects to the external world. And the perspective they come from, like right now it makes sense when we think about logic and we think about statistical models, it's very natural to think about how they relate to the world. But this is what I was saying in the introduction, that it's important to think about how the context in which we learn things influences the way we view things. And the metaphors of our time tell us about what we think intelligent systems are. In the 1800s, people saw steam engines and they thought of the mind as a steam engine. And now we think of computers and we say the mind is a computer. So to understand where these thinkers were coming from when they developed these theories, we have to look at what was the common knowledge at their time about how the universe worked. And this is probably someone you never would expect to see in an AI lecture, but Georg Hegel in the 1800s was the predominant philosopher of the 1800s, and everybody who went to school learned about Hegel's work. Hegel was writing primarily in the early 1800s, and one thing that he did really well was that he created a very complicated system that allowed science, logic, and religion to come together in a unified way. And he was writing in a time when Newton and others were showing that the world was mechanistic, and you could make predictions showing that the world had some sort of mechanical structure to it. So he united everything under one system, and everyone in the 1800s was learning about this philosopher. And one thing that he really believed was that putting all these systems of knowledge under one umbrella, we're on a progression, a path toward this absolute knowledge where we integrate all of these systems together. And this was the working model of how the universe worked. And not only that, Hegel was a monist, so he believed we are all universal minds, and everything is related to everything else by internal relations. And if you take out one piece, everything falls apart. So there's only one object, and it's just the mind, and there is no external world that we have any access to. So there was a skepticism about our ability to know what actually exists out there. So this point of view seems really unusual to us now because we have a whole century of science behind us that's explored the external world, but at this time, this is what everyone was working with. So AI would have never come about in this time period. But thankfully, this system, which is called idealism, is opposed by realism, and this is what Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, when they were at Oxford in the 1880s, they were taking classes by the preeminent philosopher McTaggart, who was teaching this philosophy, and they rejected all of it, thinking about how the external world could relate to our minds. And drawing inspiration from Aristotle, they would try to clarify truth and knowledge rather than use philosophy as a way for ethical or moral or spiritual improvement. They were interested in precision and formalizing language and formalizing the way we think about the world. And they started with some assumptions. First, that everyday objects we see around us are actually real. So they took away a lot of the skepticism that people like Hume and Berkeley brought to science and philosophy, and just said the common sense notion is that if we see something around us, it really is there. And they also questioned the ontological status of mathematical and logical things like sets, relations, and properties, believing that they actually exist too, and that an object of thought also exists as well. So what you can see here are the seeds of a language that grounds our thoughts with the external world. We take our sense data in, we make logical propositions about that, and then we express that as a way to characterize what the world is about. This was totally unique in this time period. No one had ever done this, and it was a very weird way of looking at the world that would take a long time to receive the acceptance that it now has. And they would go on to clarify this. Moore's papers that I have down here, he first rejects the idealist philosophy of Hegel in these papers, and Russell would later, especially in his 1905 paper, come up with the theory of descriptions, which was the first attempt at formalizing language into symbols. And this is the language that would eventually be used by the AI researchers in the 1950s. So a related project to this was the work of Russell and Whitehead in their very ambitious 3-volume, 2,000-page work, the Principia Mathematica, which was trying to legitimize mathematics by grounding it in arithmetic axioms and then grounding those axioms in logic. So Russell and Whitehead, the way they thought about this question was that, well, we have an axiom, which is a proposition we take as given without proof, and we use that to build a theory which follows as a logical consequence from these axioms. Theorems are all statements that can be proven from these axioms. So the purpose of doing this is to clarify mathematical knowledge and ground mathematical knowledge in logic. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because they would run into some problems when trying to do this. This would lead to some paradoxes. And this is important because one of the paradoxes they ran into, kind of the final nail in the coffin for what they were trying to do, would be the question that Turing would try to answer, be related to the question Turing would try to answer with the Turing machines. So in 1931, Kurt Gödel noticed something, which is that any consistent first-order theory of arithmetic, like the one that Russell and Whitehead was trying to create, is incomplete in some sense, and that some truths are always unprovable. All we can get is a decidable subset of axioms from which every provable theorem can be shown to be true. But you can't prove all possible arithmetic proofs. So if we can't derive all mathematical truths from a fixed set of axioms, arithmetic axioms, no logical axioms that could ground this could do it either. There's a lot of nuance in this topic, so this is just a very general statement about this. But this will come up again in our question of Turing machines, because the same conclusions that Turing would draw in his paper relate to the same problem that Russell and Whitehead had in making the foundations of mathematics and logic. I don't have time to talk about this today, but afterwards, ask me about this book, because a lot of people abuse Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and it's just something I like talking about, so I'd be happy to talk about this afterwards. So the next step here is connecting logic to the external world. This is something that I would actually like to go into far more detail in than we have time today, but the short story is that Bertrand Russell would eventually go on to form his system of logical atomism, and this would be extended upon by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his work, the Tractatus, where he tried to formalize the way in which we view the world through sense data and how knowledge can be decomposed into logical statements about that data. And this would form a whole movement called the logical positivist movement in Vienna in the 1920s and 30s, who would extend upon this work. And if you read some of their writing, you see that they are actually really AI researchers. They have the same sort of perspective, and they think about the world in the same way. And the ideas they provided were circulating all around the academic literature in the 1940s and 50s. And it's thanks to them that we have the perspective we do now, as well as the AI researchers in the 50s who also had the same sort of perspective of ways of thinking about the world. So we've pretty briefly covered some of those two things, and now we're going to round off the development of a theory of computation by finally turning to Turing himself. In 1936, he would develop his Turing machine theory and define what an algorithm is formally. So he would try to answer this question about what things can actually be computed. So this comes from David Hilbert, who in the 1900s, he's a famous mathematician. He published an open set of mathematical questions that had not been answered yet, and his 10th question would be revised in 1928 as the decision problem. So the decision problem starts like this. We have axioms and a math proposition we want to prove. Can we prove or decide, it's a decision problem, if the proposition is true or false? And do such steps actually exist to characterize this, or maybe they don't? This set of steps would become the basis of what Turing would call an algorithm or an effective procedure. And he would propose Turing machines as a solution to this, while his doctoral advisor, Alonzo Church, would provide lambda calculus, which Turing in his paper shows have equivalent solutions. So if we take a look at Turing's 1936 paper, the first thing he thinks about is how to turn this into a bit of a thought experiment. Let's say we have, he says, imagine a man in the process of computing a real number. So a mathematician would be writing something on a piece of paper, some sort of symbols, think about it in his brain in some way, do some computations, and then write out some kind of an answer. And he would do this by transforming or manipulating those symbols according to some kinds of rules and come up with an output. So can we build a machine that can replicate that process and come up with the same output or decision as this man does, deciding if a proposition is true or false? So Turing would take the idea of that paper and he'd turn it into a strip, divide that strip up in his paper, and he claims that this is we have a machine which has a finite set of states. He calls these M, or machine configurations, that it can be in. We can draw a square. In each of the squares, we can draw a symbol. And there's a scanner that can read the symbol to put it into the machine. And the scanner can move left and right to access different squares. And in the blank squares, the machine can read, write, or erase symbols. Turing says that these properties include all those which are used in the computations of a number. And so this is how he sets up a Turing machine. This is the first one that actually is in his paper. If you have a machine that's in state B and you want to move to state C, all you do is, in this particular machine, you print a 0, and then you move 1 to the right. So we're printing a 0, move 1 to the right. Then to move to state E, we move the scanner 1 to the right. To move to state F, we print a 1, and then we move 1 to the right. And then to move back to state B, we move 1 to the right again. So this is more of a didactic example. Obviously, this Turing machine just prints a 0 and a 1 separated by a blank continuously. But amazingly, this setup can be used with the right set of rules and the right number of steps to describe any kind of symbol manipulation task. I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's the basic idea. And if powerful enough with the right architecture, it could even simulate other Turing machines. And this would be what's called a universal Turing machine. So to give you just one more example that's a little bit more concrete, if we were going to do addition, you can see on the bottom on the left side over there, the input has 2 zeros, so we can think of that as 2 plus 2, the symbol in the middle separating them, and then the output being 4. And so the Turing machine for addition is shown here, with the arrow in the top left being the input, and it would cycle through these steps, eventually giving you your output. So this is the basis for what Turing developed. And to understand exactly what the significance of this was to solving the decision problem, we have to ask a little bit about languages and decidability. So a language means you have a set of sequences or symbols from an alphabet. You take those, and the substrings that you can make from that is your language. So a language is decidable if the Turing machine can tell you yes or no about whether the input will give you the output, and recognizable if it can only tell you yes about whether the input will give you the output. So this is a simple example to illustrate this. If our language is composed of zeros of increasing length, all of those are valid words in our language, we can ask, is the given input string part of our language? And the Turing machine that would tell us this is shown here. You can see on the bottom left, we start at 0, and in state A, we will keep cycling through state A as long as there's a 0, moving 1 to the right, until we get to a blank, in which case we're going to accept it because there's 4 zeros. So we have a set of steps, a procedure, or an algorithm, which will give us a yes answer to this question. This is what the decision problem was asking. But this is not part of our language, because our language consisted of only zeros. So here, the Turing machine would cycle through state A 3 times, and then when it would reach the 1, it would move 1 to the right, and it would reject it. So this Turing machine is able to come up with a solution. And as it turns out, there are some problems for which no algorithm, a set of operations or instructions, is guaranteed to find a solution in finite time. And this, we don't have time to go into today, but is actually very much related to the reason, to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. The inability to compute certain things is related to the same inability to prove certain theorems from a set of fixed recursive axioms. So the important point here is leading to this generalization called the Church-Turing thesis, which tells us that the results show there is no Turing machine that can decide if an arbitrary formula of logic is valid. But Church's thesis extends this further, that if it's algorithmically unsolvable, then no mechanism we build will come to the right decision in finite time. So the reason this is important is because it tells us something about what physical systems are possible to build and what kinds of things can actually be computed. So before we can even start talking about how to build an AI system, it's important to have this groundwork set to give us an idea about what things can be computed. And there's even the open question, which is debated in the philosophy literature, of whether or not the brain is a Turing machine. Maybe we can do things that Turing machines can't replicate, and this is sort of still an open question. And it is worth mentioning that Turing machines are part of a larger class of other kinds of machines that are related in complexity theory and automata theory. And this book, I really recommend reading this book by Michael Sipser. Actually, I have all my references at the end of the slide, and I'll be posting them online. So, but this book is an excellent introduction to all of these ideas. Okay, so the next place we're going to go now is to see what happened with Turing's theory. So in the 1940s, von Neumann would develop the von Neumann architecture, which is the first modern computer. And Turing's ideas were all very theoretical. He didn't provide a way to actually build these machines he talked about. Von Neumann would take them and he would add other things like computer memory and other architecture that you needed to really build a proper computer. And our modern computer really inherits from the work that von Neumann did in the 1940s. And you'll see here that I've also added a little bit on connectionism and neural networks. We're not going to talk about those today, but I wanted to just put some of the events up here just so you can see the historical context of what was going on at the same time. So the final point is going to be a very brief one. This is the shift away from behaviorism that would occur in the 1940s and 50s. So behaviorism has its roots in functional psychology of William James, who looked at the relation between organisms and their environment and the dynamics between the two. And it would influence this large set of theories that generally studied the way in which organisms responded to a stimulus. So it ignored what happened in the middle and tried to understand behavior by connecting inputs and outputs together rather than trying to figure out the calculations that go on in between them. And the most well-known form of this is Skinner's radical behaviorism. And there was a lot of critique going on about this in the 1940s, and all of it would really come to a head when Chomsky would criticize Skinner's work by saying that, Noam Chomsky would say that Skinner's experimental results can be applied to complex human behavior only in the most gross and superficial way. Although this paper was written in 1959, it encapsulates all of the arguments that had started brewing in the 1940s, and Chomsky's paper is really worth reading. It essentially jump-started the modern field of cognitive neuroscience. And he would go on to say that one would naturally expect that predictions of the behavior of a complex organism or machine would require, in addition to information about external stimulation, knowledge of the internal structure of the organism, the ways in which it processes input information, and organizes its own behavior. So I think this perspective is really important because thinking of the brain as just input and output without looking in between limits the way and the kinds of experiments you can do, and it limits the way you can think about what computation is. And that would limit the way that people would look at AI systems as well. And I think the shift away from this thinking was paramount for people to begin thinking about how to actually model computational processes that go on in the brain in artificial systems. So with these four origins out of the way, we're now able to finally look at the question that Turing tried to answer in the 1950s, namely, what is intelligence? Well, there is no agreed upon definition for what intelligence is in any field, really, but he wanted to provide a formal test for intelligence. And that's what he did in the 1950s, this landmark paper. He calls it the Turing test, or in the paper it's called the imitation game. And the way it works is there's an interrogator in one room, and there's someone in the other room of an unknown gender, and the interrogator's job is to write questions on a piece of paper and slip them under the door, and the person on the other side of the room has to answer those questions honestly. And the interrogator has to guess that gender of that person by asking questions about their clothes or appearance or something, but he can't actually see who's on the other side. So with enough back and forth, eventually the interrogator should be able to guess the gender of the person on the other side. So Turing suggests, what if we replace the person on the other side of the room with a computer who is able to generate certain responses? Could the computer fool the interrogator? And he believes that if this is true, then the computer has essentially passed the Turing test and shown some level of human-level intelligence. So this has generated a number of responses. In the many years that follow, there would be a lot of ink and pixels spilled over this question, and there isn't really any consensus on whether or not we've really passed the Turing test. There are people that say that the systems now are able to, but this is not fully agreed upon. And it's a good starting point, though, and Turing has some anticipated objections. I'm only going to cover a couple of them, but in his paper, which is totally worth reading, he goes through these in more detail. These ones are less interesting, but they're more just about like common views held at the time, like about God doesn't give soul to machines, or that we don't want to believe a machine can be intelligent because of the consequences. For that last point, Turing actually doesn't even respond to it. He just says consolation would be more appropriate. There's also the mathematical objections that Turing machines are discrete state machines. They have discrete states in their construction, whereas the brain is a continuous state machine. And Turing brings up this idea. He says it's possible that discretizing those continuous states and approximating them with a Turing machine, maybe there's something we can't capture there. It's not clear. He also acknowledges that it's possible that there are unknown laws that govern the brain, physical laws that we just don't know about yet. And this always reminds me of, in the early 90s, Roger Penrose, a really well-known physicist, published a famous book on consciousness called The Emperor's New Mind. And he basically has this quantum theory of consciousness, which sounds kind of new agey, but this is a well-known physicist. And it's a really classic book that's really worth reading, but he was one of the first to kind of propose a theory about how there could be other types of effects going on in the brain, and he argues that Turing machines are not going to cut it when we're trying to simulate human-like intelligence. There's also some arguments about human behavior and understanding. One of these would be Lady Ada Lovelace's objection about how computers can't create anything new. And Turing's response to this is kind of prophetic in that he says, he suggests that the machines could have feedback and learning rules that could help them update their knowledge and create their new rules on their own. And this is very much like what modern machine learning does today. And the last argument I'm just going to briefly talk about, but this is more of a solipsistic argument, that the only way to know if a computer is intelligent is to be that computer itself. And this is not a very useful argument because you could make that argument about anybody that we see around us, but we take for granted that everyone has the same, that they are intelligent in the same way that we are. So it doesn't really help. It kind of just moves the goalposts down. So following the Turing test, we finally, at 30 minutes in, come to the actual beginning of the AI conference that started it all. 1956, this is the beginning of symbolic artificial intelligence, the way of thinking about the world in this way, and finding a way to use symbolic logic to design intelligent systems. So in symbolic AI, we use logical rules explicitly to code behaviors and features, and I'll give an example of this in a few slides. And at this conference, which was in 1956, John McCarthy, who would eventually go on to invent Lisp, the Lisp programming language in a couple of years, kind of the official AI programming language, would be this conference among many others, including the well-known computer scientist Marvin Minsky. Claude Shannon, the inventor of information theory, would be here as well. And Newell, Simon, and Shaw would debut their program, The Logic Theorist, which was able to prove theorems from Whitehead's Principia Mathematica using symbolic logic. And there was so much excitement and fervor generated from this conference and the years that followed that a decade later, Marvin Minsky would claim that in a generation, the problem of artificial intelligence creation would be solved at a significant level. This turned out to be mostly false, probably very false, as we'll see shortly. And this gives us an opportunity now to start thinking about what did they mean exactly by using symbols to code rules in an AI system? What does that mean exactly? So we've talked about ways of connecting logic to the external world and all these foundations that we have now. This is kind of a degenerate example, but it'll give you the picture. You can have a set of symbols that tell you all the rules for what different family members are. What kinds of properties do family members have, and what abstract variables, which are x and y here, can we put into these symbols to instantiate them. So what we have is we can fill in those with things like these names. And now, because we have a set of rules that tell you how all family members relate to one another, you can derive new rules about any given set of variables that you put in. And you can use this to make inferences and ask questions like, does Bobby have a sister, or is Luke the father to anyone, and so on. So this same general strategy can be used in, I think chess is a good, easy example to think about, where you have a set of rules that you can follow and certain decisions to make. And with the right optimization procedure and heuristic searches, you might be able to make the right inferences about what the optimal decision to take is to solve a particular task. And you can also put this knowledge together in a semantic network. A lot of what are called expert systems did this throughout the 1980s, where experts would put in the relationship between different types of categories, code them in with symbolic logic, and then you could manipulate those networks in certain ways, make inferences and questions about them to get new sort of insights and answers when you query them. Most of those systems have died out by now. The only one that remains, really, I think, is the psych program, which is really cool. If you just look it up now, they've continued to update the human knowledge base. And I think in the 90s, they had something like 1 million or more nodes of different language categories. But by and large, this approach has failed because it takes a lot of human effort and time, and knowledge gets outdated really quickly, especially in the last 10 years, where it's basically every single day your knowledge is outdated. So following this, I think one of the major, next major landmarks really comes from, actually from philosophy. Hilary Putnam would talk about functionalism. There was a lot of talk in the 1960s and 70s that artificial intelligence required the right substrate to be, or intelligence in general required the right substrate, meaning human intelligence. You had to have human systems, like you had to have the human wetware, neurons, and things like that to make an intelligent system what it is. And Hilary Putnam's work would really show how as long as you have the right mechanism, intelligence could come out of that system. You don't need to have a human brain to demonstrate that. And a lot of his arguments were key in showing that in the causal relationships between inputs and outputs in Turing machines, which he pioneered the work in. And there's also Newell and Simon's general problem solver, which is the next major landmark. It's one of the most famous AI programs in the 1960s. And the way this works is he gave college students these problems to solve. They were IQ test problems or different kinds of problems in reasoning. And then he asked them careful questions. They both asked them careful questions about how they solved the problems. And they took these general rules and coded them into logical statements. And these rules about how symbols were manipulated were about how the symbols they manipulated were used to solve problems and give them an output. And they narrowed it down to 3 algorithms or procedures that could manipulate these symbols and give an output that they claimed, while does not replicate human intelligence, does capture the general features of human reasoning and decision making. And this is one of the first attempts to try to capture what a human does when they think through a problem in a formal symbolic logic system. This is a symbol. This would lead them in 15 years to come up with this physical symbol system hypothesis. I'm not going to read through all this text, but basically their idea was that they wanted to think about physical systems that you could build, like Turing machines, and also the types of symbol structures you could make and formalize some of these ideas. And they would come up with this grand theory about what physical symbol systems are and how they can be manipulated, transformed, and operated on to form something that with the right size and organization would exhibit properties similar to human-like intelligence. And it's interesting to think about this question when I've heard the exact same statement made many times in the last decade about deep neural networks, that they can't do certain things, but if they had the right structure and orientation and the right connections, maybe they could have human-like intelligence. So it's interesting to see that some of the arguments that came up in the 1960s and 70s come up in a different form again now, too. And importantly, because a physical system is a type of Turing machine, we can therefore simulate it on a computer. And that's kind of the point of this paper. So this brings up a really important point that I think is often overlooked, which is how symbols actually communicate meaning. And so we have syntax, which is the logical rules that relate symbols together in a system. But something about human mental states have what in philosophy of mind you might call semantic content, or more vaguely aboutness. There's some aboutness to our representations of the world. When we think about something, it's not just a data structure that's stored in memory that captures some feature of the world in a numerical way. There's something more to it, where in human content we have memories, we have intentions. So what is missing in there? And John Searle would propose in 1980 his Chinese room experiment. He was a big skeptic of AI making any progress at all. And he claimed that AI systems have absolutely no idea what they're doing. And his thought experiment here is meant to prove that. So he says, what if, he's kind of riffing off of the Turing test here, but he said, what if I'm stuck in a room and someone is passing me sheets of paper under the door that have Chinese characters written on them? If I have a Chinese English dictionary, I essentially have a massive lookup table. And if I spend enough time with that, I could look up every single symbol and write something down on that paper and send it back out the door. And someone on the other side might be convinced that I speak Chinese and I'm fluent and I understand the content of the meaning behind the content of what I've translated. But I have no idea what's going on. I just have a massive lookup table. I only have memorized and understood the syntax, but I don't understand the semantics. This is similar to thinking about a parrot, which can repeat phrases back and forth by learning rules of syntax about how words relate together in certain patterns. But it's not clear if a parrot really understands what it's saying. There's some debate on this too, but this is kind of illustrates the example. And this has been an open question of how syntax relates to semantics. The problem is that in symbol systems, there are these isolated systems whose meaning is extrinsic because they only refer to other symbols within the system, not actually grounding within anything in the outside world. So the question is, how do symbols get grounded in the first place? And I think a reason why this confusion has arisen, because a lot of computer scientists have not understood this, they thought this is kind of a stupid problem, and a lot of philosophers have been upset that computer scientists have not understood the significance of this problem. And I think this is a historical artifact of the way in which we look at symbols. We inherit, I say we, but I mean neuroscientists inherit symbols from the perspective of the American pragmatist Charles Sanders Peirce, who had a triadic view of symbols. You need the object, that which is being represented, and the physical substrate or context in which that representation is occurring, which means each individual and their particular system. So symbols are relative to each system, and we have some grounding in the world, and when I have conversations with people or I'm giving a talk or something, we're all slightly adjusting our symbol landscapes to get on common ground and try to figure out where we lie with one another. And this is a very different perspective than the one that's taken by there's the whole school of linguistics on the French side, as well as the computer science school, which looks at symbols in a more data-driven kind of way. So this is really coming down to the symbol grounding problem, which is a really well-known problem in philosophy of mind and about AI. It was first proposed by Stefan Harnad in 1990, and this is basically what I've already been talking about, that symbols only refer to other symbols within a system. So how do they get grounded? And in this really well-formulated paper, he talks about, could you learn Chinese as a second language from a Chinese dictionary? Well, all the symbols in the dictionary just refer to other symbols. So it's possible you could get some leverage because you already speak a language and learn a little bit about it. But what if you had to learn Chinese as a first language from a Chinese dictionary? And he claims this is what AI systems essentially, they have this internal system where everything refers to everything else, but they don't actually refer to anything outside in the world. So I think one reason why this has caused so much confusion in the literature is because it's not the case that symbolic AI can't use grounded symbols. It's the fact that computer scientists and programmers have put their own grounded symbols into the machines, and the machines are then using those. And we still do this today when we have supervised learning and we have negative and positive examples, or we constrain the problem space in some way. We're putting our grounding into the system. The question is not if AI can do that, can use grounded symbols, but whether they can autonomously ground their own symbols. And it's believed this is not really possible without two things which are going to become really important in the second talk. One is a dynamic interaction with the world, so models where systems are able to learn through interactions with the environment, and also compression, being able to compress algorithmic compression using minimum description length, which is something we'll talk about in the next talk as well. And a system that's sufficiently done that might be able to ground symbols. So this is related to the question that we asked in the beginning of how do intelligent systems represent knowledge. There isn't a real clear answer to this, and it's probably a mistake to bring up representation at all. This is a paper I found that called Representation Where Philosophy Goes When It Dies. This is something that's kind of, there's no agreed upon definition of what representation is, and it's caused a lot of problems in the literature. And this is actually one of my favorite topics, so maybe one day I'll give a talk on this, but the idea is that representations are between are arbitrary relations between symbols and objects. And how they get grounded in machines is an open question. How machines represent something in the same way that we do, where meaning for us is a system of interactions with the world. When we represent something in our brains, it's more than just a data structure. There's a lot more going on there. And we represent things in a very different way to establish meaning, and they're relative to each individual. So this is an open question that still needs resolution, and we'll talk more about it in a few weeks. So I promised myself I wouldn't just do like a bullet point checklist of landmarks, because I think that's boring, but I think it is important now just to go through a few of the last discoveries in the 1960s that I think were important landmarks in AI, and then I'll wrap up after that. The human brain is really good at dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity, but this is hard to capture in logic. So I think that the development of fuzzy logic in the 1960s was an important landmark in being able to code systems that were a bit more flexible. We also have Dendral, which was one of the first expert systems. It was used in computing molecular structures. And there were many derivatives that would follow from it that are still, in some ways, part of some laboratory systems today in a very different form. They're probably being replaced at this point now with deep learning and everything else going on. ELIZA was created by Weizenbaum, is a reasoning system that can converse in English. And it was one of the first types of systems like this. And if you've ever used the text editor Emacs, there's a kind of Easter egg in there of this psychotherapy program you can just mess around with. I think it's still bundled with the program, and it actually uses ELIZA for that system. It was believed that the secret to human, the way in which humans are very quickly able to find solutions was through methods of heuristic search. So there were a number of tree methods and optimization algorithms developed in this time to search through large state spaces and find optimal solutions to problems very quickly. And variations of this, as well as many different biologically inspired search algorithms and emergent evolution algorithms that would come out in the 80s, would draw inspiration from this. We didn't talk about the perceptron here, but it would essentially die out here, and this would kill the early research in neural networks. The perceptron died because Minsky and Papert would publish a book in 1969 where they would show that the perceptron could not solve the well-known XOR problem, so it could not solve nonlinear decision boundaries, and that they were actually kind of positive about the perceptron in this book, but it sort of killed interest in research in it. We also have Shaky the robot here, which is one of the first robotic systems that could do decision-making and motor movement. And 1970s saw the beginning of the SRI research group, Stanford Research Institute, which in some forms and spin-offs and so on is still around today. The Prolog programming language, in addition to Lisp, this was another important programming language of early symbolic AI. And also Mycin is another expert system used for medical diagnosis. Missing from this list are definitely what are generally called cognitive architectures. So there are symbolic systems or connectionist systems that are used to mimic the brain in a more broad scale that have memory and many other kinds of operations together. I'm going to actually leave all of that for the next lecture because they relate really highly to some of the topics that we'll be talking about then. But I'm just going to cut to the chase now. 1970s, really what happened here at this point was there was all this interest in symbolic systems, but the AI bubble had burst, and there was less funding, less interest, and it did not live up to the expectations. Machine translation, which was promised, really didn't take off. It failed. The hype failed around this, and DARPA started to cut funding. And Hogland would actually describe this, you see the top left, he would call it GOF AI, good old-fashioned AI. And you might sometimes see that now if you look at blog posts. That's kind of what we call symbolic AI now. And this is essentially the beginning of the AI winter, a period where there was less interest, less funding, and less hype in the market about AI research. And sometimes people talk about a second AI winter. There was a brief bump in the 1980s, a renewed interest in expert systems and large projects like the fifth generation project in the 80s. And expert systems, the market failed in this time, it was hyped up that every single software has to have an expert system, put it in everything, and this was going all the time throughout the 80s. But expert systems had to be continuously updated, and they were expensive and domain specific, so they all died out. I saw a really cool talk at Data Day a few weeks ago that covered a lot of this stuff, and one of the authors of this paper was at the talk. I highly recommend it if you want to go look at more detail about this whole history of knowledge graphs and data, and they kind of up from then up until now, leading up to Google in 2012 has kind of brought some of these ideas back in again, and there's some proposals about combining it with deep learning and other systems and things like that. So I have included this in the references as well. Okay, I'm just basically going to wrap up here and just talk about the legacy. Marvin Minsky, the computer scientist who, in a previous slide, was so passionate and enthusiastic, in the 1980s, he would say, "For generations, scientists and philosophers have tried to explain ordinary reasoning in terms of logical principles with virtually no success. I suspect this enterprise failed because it was looking in the wrong direction. Common sense works so well not because it is an approximation of logic. Logic is only a small part of our great accumulation of different useful ways to chain things together." This sentiment is really echoed by a lot of AI skeptics like Jerry Fedor or Herbert Dreyfus, who would criticize this rationalist enterprise of looking at logic and trying to capture things that apparently are not possible with logic. And I think there are some arguments to be made today against some of these points. There are some papers showing how deep generative models can learn, their model can learn its own uncertainty. There are papers showing artificial curiosity and theoretical constructs of what imagination might be like. DeepMind released a theoretical paper about using something resembling metaphor to translate between different domains. So some of these questions might be resolved soon, and maybe not in the exact same form that people imagine them they would be in the 1960s. And really the last point is just thinking about how prediction is not the same as explanation. Our thinking about what explanation is largely comes from Hempel's work in philosophy of science, and predicting tells you something about what a system is going to do, but it doesn't explain what that system does. And there's a renewed interest now in trying to understand more about how systems operate and getting better at understanding what intelligence actually is, and not just what a system does and how it can predict something. And I think this is going to be kind of the new frontier of AI research, is getting more and more into answering some of these questions in more detail. So this was kind of, I think, an unusual talk for history of AI, but I tried to cover a broad set of subjects, and I hope that if you're thinking about AI research now, you will go back and read some of the papers and read some of the things in the past and think about the ways in which you think about AI are influencing the way that you design systems and the way that you look at problems. Because history might repeat itself. We really don't know where we are. We don't know if we are near another AI winter or what's going to happen next. But I think going back and reading the primary literature and looking at the way that researchers think about these problems is really important to solving these problems and coming up with new ideas. I have all my references here, so I will, as I said before, I'll post this online. But that's all I've got for you tonight, and thank you for coming out here. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you. It's very good to review.
Okay.
I have a question about the aspect for what you're looking at all the aspects of the things that came from mathematics and philosophy.
Sure.
You kind of neglected things that came from biology. Like, for example, Hegel learning again, self-organization, all those aspects you did. And you kind of like skipped aside.
Yes.
Explain why you chose this.
Yeah, so the question was about, there's a lot of inspiration from biological systems, and I focused largely on mathematics and philosophy as the background for this. So why did I skip over that? I think biological self-organization is perhaps the most important piece of understanding AI, and it's going to be a large focus of the next talk, because a lot of that work came about in the 1980s when there was a little bit, well, some of the work in So I'm going to talk about cybernetics as well and some other fields that came about then, but I'm talking specifically about looking at complex systems. And some of that work, like Prigoghine's work in the 1970s, the work of Rodney Brooks, Varela's work on embodied cognition, those are kind of some of the inspirations I'm going to draw from. In the 1950s, there's some work as well. Sure. Cool. I'd like to talk to you about this more afterwards. I want to hear kind of who you're talking about. I'd be interested to hear more. But yeah, that'll be something I'll cover next time. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you showed the paper, like the representation, that's where philosophy goes on.
Yeah.
So, and you said there seems to be a lot of disagreement. Is that what you said?
About what representation means. Yeah.
So, what are the examples?
So this is because there's the. Yeah, sure. The question is about how I mentioned in one of the slides how representation is a contentious area of philosophy, and there's different disagreements about what exactly it means, and he was just asking more for me to clarify that statement and give examples of what that means. So the problem is that no one has an agreed upon definition of what representation is. There have been all these attempts, it came mainly in like philosophy of science, where they said, okay, how does a model represent reality? Is it isomorphic to reality? Is it a structuralist version of reality? Are there axioms that you start with and then it represents because the axioms resemble reality? Do you start with a general theory and then break them down into axioms going the other direction? How do you deal with something like misrepresentation, where you represent something in the wrong way? Or how do you deal with something where you're representing something that doesn't actually exist, which our brain does all the time? There are entities that are in our brain that don't exist in the real world. So the disagreement comes, first of all, from not being able to articulate a good theory which is capturing everything. Because like, a chemistry model of a ball and stick for the chemical atoms, that represents. How is that different from a model that, like a picture represents something? Words represent things. Symbols in humanities, you talk about representations all the time. A meme is a representation. It's such an overloaded term that it's hard to narrow down exactly what it means. And that's kind of the problem, is that everybody has their own definition and no one really agrees on what it is. Yeah. Any other questions? Fifth generation project. Yeah, in Japan, there was this sort of grand overarching project to kind of collectively pull together this data knowledge network with a lot of different companies and research that was involved in this giant project that was supposed to change how we did everything, essentially. It's kind of a universal AI project of sorts, and it just didn't pan out throughout the 80s. Yes? Yeah?
Put this in perspective a little bit.
Sure.
Every city in the country competed to get that organization to be landed there, and Austin landed it. It was an organization called MCC. And the thing you talked about, Psych, was a project within MCC, a bunch of other things. And it is credited by Joshua Barrett as being the foundation of the kickoff of Austin's tech scene. I think that may be a little bit over because IBM was here before, or Motorola was here before, a bunch of other things. But he saw that as the generation of the driving force behind Austin becoming a tech center. Was MCC, and it was all in total fear of the Japanese. They basically kicked the United States butt in virtually everything that they'd taken on: automobiles, consumer electronics, and so on. And they decided they were going to skip the fourth generation, go from third generation computers to the fifth generation computers, which were going to be AI based, and then and therefore obliterate the United States as an unnecessary and lagging in the fourth generation. So if you're so that was MCC, which is
Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Can you elaborate more on the AI winter from your perspective? Because I hear different stories and variations of stories of what happened there. So can you elaborate a bit more about the AI?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. That having not lived through that, I can only rely on reading, a lot of. My idea of it was that more that um, there was a continuous hyping of what AI could do, and it was promised in everything, and people were trying to put it in every product they could. There were all these Lisp machines, and everyone was pumping money into it, and it slowly was not quite living up and kind of hitting this wall. Like, people were constantly putting money and effort into it, and there was a certain level that was not really passed. And so interest was just starting to wane. It was kind of a drop off, but research continued through that because people are always researching all kinds of things all the time. So there were a lot of important discoveries still made then, but it did not have quite the same amount of enthusiasm as earlier. Yeah. Sure.
What do those points represent? Is it like amorphic, or is it like this happened in that date, this happened in that?
So the choosing 1974 was more because that's when DARPA cut funding, and that was kind of a point where the research would then decline. It was slow over that period of time. Yeah. Oh, right. I remember something about this. Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Jacob. I'm only going to add a slight detail because Sanjeev knows way more than I do. In 1974, there was something called the Lighthill Report. The UK Parliament had asked this professor named Lighthill to kind of give an overview, and I think there's a pretty good Wikipedia page with a lot of details here, to kind of give an overview, because they were thinking about funding going into, this was 74, going into the late 70s, also early 80s. And if I remember, one of the quotes was, they have grandiose objectives, and there's a combinatorial explosion of, those are two different quotes, basically about they're going to overpromise and underdeliver. And as a result, the UK Parliament pulled a lot of funding, and I think DARPA followed suit. So I think that those were a couple of the details, but it was a Lighthill report in 74 that led to basically the AI winter, if I recall.
What's the other dates where you say that this ended?
That was more arbitrary because it's hard to always pinpoint for something like this where it was exactly when this happened. But I picked 1980 more because there was a renewed interest in expert systems a little bit during that time, where you might consider a second AI winter would be following, where there was less interest again. But I feel like that cutoff of 1980 could certainly be argued for a number of different points. But for the purpose of a timeline, I had to put something. So, yeah.
There was something that's like, you saw some papers there? Or?
Not really. I mean, it's just, this is a good point, more because a lot of research in the 1980s would have connectionism, and there would be more machine learning, which was called, I think, inductive learning at that time, and a few other things. And then complex systems analysis and things like that would start in the 80s. So other research was coming up there, which I'll talk about next time. So it's more, that's kind of where I'll partly begin next time. Yeah, go for it. When I was saying it, I meant more that I was talking more about, as an industry, the interest in those expert systems would decline, and as a result, and that was caused by the fact that there was less interest in them, but also that they were harder to maintain. So people collectively just stopped maintaining them, and slowly they fell out of favor for other types of research and systems. Does that kind of get at what you're asking? Sure. Sure. Yeah, I think there's definitely, and I agree, and I think that's one reason why there's some, like, I think Google has started some proposals on it in 2012 about everyone's talking about knowledge networks and things like that. It's kind of coming back now. I think what they did was really important, and I think it's a perspective, because it's very natural. We think more in symbols than we do in neural networks, or something like that. That's a very, hard way to look at problems. But I was talking more globally about the market for those systems. There are still expert systems around that are important today, I would say. Sure. I think we definitely need more interest in that field for sure then. Thank you. Sure. I actually volunteered, but. Great, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sanjeev, you hit me right in the feels with the Principia Mathematica. If you didn't know, I'm going to actually bore you with a slight detail, is actually change majors from computer science to math because I actually had to study out of Bertrand Russell for quite some time. And so for many years, I actually viewed the entire world from a Russell and Whitehead perspective. Yeah, anyways, you got me right in the feels in all the computational learning theory. Oh, man. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I'm going to see you at CU29, right across the street. Let's keep going with these conversations. I would love to hear your perspective on this. You can imagine that this was a very ambitious talk. There's so much that we didn't even get to. And you could see how there's a lot of breadth to this talk, and even then there's so many other things that we could have talked about. So please come over to CU29, and let's keep chatting.